and welcome to MVC Podcast. Matt, if you would intro us, please.
Welcome. Nick, Mikey, and I greet you, as today we'll be talking about COVID-19 in three aspects of what this pandemic is bringing to our society as a whole around the world. We will first talk about
the political aspect.
We will then move into talking about the
financial and economic impact of the virus.
And we will tie it all up talking about more of the environmental and science aspect of what this pandemic means to us as a species, but also as a culture. Now let's get into it. You can just
could not be maybe a more important year in terms of American politics. This year, as the election's drawing near, it's looking like a referendum on Donald Trump as president, and also a battle between conservatism and liberalism, both in the general election and in the Democratic primary. Now, COVID-19 is going to have a lot of effects on that. Not only has the economy been a stronghold of Trump's re-election bid, but also, if you can't have gatherings of more than 10 people, how are you going to have elections? And it's also what type of person you want in charge when you have this type of pandemic on your hands. Now, I'm going to start off with the local and go to the national. You know, they've actually postponed all primaries in Texas, just announced today, or maybe yesterday. What do you guys think about that? Should public safety come ahead of political, planning or, political tradition?
Well, just to jump in here, I actually have a curious thought about that. So I was just, watching the news the other day, and there's actually a congressman who tested positive for COVID-19, and they had to postpone a lot of congressional meetings, and he's had to zoom in to a lot of important meetings and discuss, a lot of topics over the phone. So if you think about this, and he was talking about when you vote on stuff in Congress, you have to be present. It's part of the Constitution that you need to be there with verbal, either for or against the law. And so if you think about this, that if congressional meetings or even at the local government, if stuff, part of the Constitution, you need to be there in presence, but you can't because of this, epidemic, that poses a lot of issues to how the government will be run and how the next president will be elected, even if the peak is sooner than November. You know what I mean?
I agree with you. I also think that this is a good time for people to become more humbled with looking at how viruses have pretty much run amok in human culture and society throughout millennia. Mother Nature's always in charge, and I do think public health should come first in front of government, because social constructs should come second to people staying alive and also people being healthy. So I definitely do think that having either a lot of more absentee ballots or finding a different type of way of people being able to vote at home in a safe, nice quarantine environment is definitely beneficial for the U.S. specifically, but also for other types of countries that need to or going about this type of government type of stuff.
Yeah, I really agree, but then I also sit there and I think, what if Trump, who, full disclosure, I'm not a huge fan of Donald Trump as a president or person, what if Donald Trump were to say, it's not safe for us to get out to the polls, we don't have the right type of infrastructure for us to have some sort of virtual election like they do in Estonia, we're canceling it, we're going to wait a year. What would you say then? Because at some point we have to obviously put political process ahead of public health, and there's that balance, because obviously there's always a flu or something going around, and we say it's fine for you to go to the polls then. So, it's a very, very tricky situation, because any sort of movement you try to make on it is going to come from the people in control, so it's going to look like a grab for power, even if it is for the safety of it.
Yeah, so actually I could actually interject here. So if you think about, if I take you back, to times of World War II and stuff, obviously these are a lot bigger instances where the whole world is, in a state of war. But, you have the U.S. postponing and continuing with the current, current president because of a national emergency, war, a change of power in that time would be very unwise of the U.S. And obviously it worked out for the better. I'm not saying that this is anywhere close to as drastic as World War II, but if you see if this epidemic does spread into the election months, then having a change of power might be very unwise, especially if you need to continue to have the same healthcare regime. You're more focused on, like Matt said, public health and the well-being of its citizens. But maybe I want to throw another question at you guys. Do you think the current administration has done enough to step up for this disease, and do you think they could have done more earlier? I know this also could bring political biases, so try to hold those off to the side. But what's your guys' thoughts on the current situation and how it could be amended?
You know what, Matt? I'm going to let you take this. I saw you visually shaking your head as he was mentioning how they handled the virus. So why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, Mikey. Well, first off, one centralized thing I have an issue with President Trump and his administration in terms of this pandemic is not taking test kits from the World Health Organization whenever the first cases were coming into our country. He then went into asking the CDC to make their own test kits, which pretty much just put us behind the ball in getting ahead of this virus, which I think is very immature of him and also just idiotic. And full disclosure, I'm also not a big fan of Donald Trump as well, but that definitely could have been handled completely differently. What about you, Mikey?
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of how they didn't take care of test kits. And then also, I have a lot of sympathy and a lot of forgiveness for someone who makes a mistake, whether it be a huge mistake or a tiny mistake. I make mistakes literally all the time. So I love it when people make mistakes because it makes me feel better about myself. What I have zero sympathy for is people who double down or people who refuse to admit they made a mistake. Now, if I was Donald Trump, I might have come out and said, you know what, guys, this is actually a lot bigger deal than we thought. We need to really revise what we said. Instead, he just kind of ignored it, and he wish-washes on everything. He goes back and forth. It's a big deal. It's not a big deal. How am I handling it? I would say I'm doing a 10 out of 10 on handling it. If he just said, we mismanaged the start of this virus, but we're going to try the best we can, I'd have a lot more respect for him. And, even his administration, the head of, the person who's really dealing with it, the head of, I think, health or whatever, said testing everyone wouldn't be a good idea. It's admit that you guys don't have enough. I'd rather you admit that your faults than just trying to pretend it's not happening. Especially considering when he says it's not a big deal, and then we see the revelations from the congressman who got a briefing on COVID virus, and it shows that they actually did know how big a deal it was way earlier. Why? Why weren't they telling us? If we could have locked down a little bit sooner, we could have saved lives, and we could have saved businesses too. It's just ridiculous, and I'm not a huge fan of how he's dealt with it, and I think it will actually hurt him in his presidential bid because people are going to see that. I would hope.
Mm-hmm. And then kind of going on my take, I'd say I'm the biggest moderate in this room right now. But I do think there was a lot of things he could have done before this virus even reached the U.S. I think the minute he saw, the administration saw how much of an issue it was posing to China, I think they really should have taken proactive measures and should have dealt with test kits early. I think with patient zero, when he came into Washington State, I think they didn't really handle that situation as seriously as it could have been. As well as now, I think they're really, not to bring it over to the financial aspect, but they're really, kind of bobbling the idea of fiscal stimulus right now. And so I think, if they wanted to effectively mend the economy right now, as in, we could possibly hit a recession with just virus itself, they should have really been proactive on coming out with a fiscal stimulus plan as soon as they saw how much of an effect it was having on Europe, Japan, China, and all these other countries. Does it seem like we have enough time to move on to that subject now?
Yeah, I think that there's obvious interplay between financial and political gains. As I mentioned when I started talking about this, Trump, having a great economy, having a strong economy has been one of his selling points as a candidate. And if we go into a recession, which is looking increasingly likely that we will go into some form of financial downturn in the next couple months, as this lockdown continues, it's going to significantly hurt his bid. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts, Nick, on what you think is, one, going to happen to the economy, and then two, what could they have done to maybe slow this down? Because I've seen a lot of things like checks to people, halting all mortgage payments, halting all bank loans, like a lot of suggestions going through. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the biggest thing right now that we're seeing with, like you mentioned, the checks, halting student loan payments, lowering interest rates across the globe, is really just to keep liquidity and keep capital in the hands of the consumers. Because if you think about it, the U.S. economy right now has been as strong for as long as it's been because of the consumers. Mm-hmm. Like, consumer spending has been an all-time high, and really it's driven, if you think about the GDP equation, it's really driven a primary portion of that equation. Also government expenditures has been really healthy, and that's why Trump himself is trying to support major private and public institutions like airports, the airline industry will be, supplying to the restaurant and public food industry to kind of keep those companies afloat. So I think the biggest thing right now, if you're thinking about how can I help as a consumer in quarantine, I think try to still support local business if you can. Go to your local grocery store, order takeout. Still try to support businesses in every way you can. But I think what he could have done better, like I was talking about earlier, is come up with a fiscal stimulus plan sooner. As in, they're still delaying this. Like, this still has to pass Congress and the Senate. I think there's a lot of things that should be implemented right away. Like, they should have injection into the consumers right away. Like, that should not be an issue. I think the bigger plan of which industries to support and how much is more complex, and that can wait, as in the private sector is going to be able to still stay afloat amid some of this. But I think going on the re-election bid and how this affects President Trump himself, I think everything he's done with the tax cuts and everything, and why he has been, his approval rating has been higher over time, is because of how well it's done. But if you think about now, the Dow and then the S&P are now both in bear markets. They've dropped over approximately around 30%, as well as you can see that they've dropped from when he was elected, the spike that they gained when he was elected till now, they've actually lost all their value since he was elected. So if you're thinking that from an investor but also consumer perspective, that adds a lot of fears to the overall economy. But I'd be curious to hear what you guys think on your side.
Would you mind just, for some of our listeners who might not be as well versed, liquidity crisis and bear market might be a little
of course. So a bear market is when you have both of these indexes, the Dow Jones and the S&P, are the most common American indexes, drop like over 20%. And then with a liquidity crisis, basically liquidity is just cash and money that flows throughout the economy. And so on a high level, if you think about it, like, you want money to be able to flow freely and not, be stuck within the pockets of the consumers, because the more money that's flowing around, the better off everyone is. And so with a liquidity crisis in most recessions, like 2008 and then possibly now, has been because there hasn't been enough cash in the economy. There's also been some other issues, but that's the biggest reason, and that's the first thing Trump is trying to solve with his stimulus plan. Mm-hmm. So I'd be curious to hear what you guys think about it, what you've seen on your end.
Okay. Well, I am actually really curious on this bill that Congress is trying to pass. It's very similar to Andrew Yang's universal basic income idea, $1,000 for every American over 18 years old. And I'm just kind of curious on kind of the implications that will have in terms of this, like, incoming recession for our country, and like if that will even help us right now, like short term. I definitely do think it's a good idea long term to have that type of defense for any type of family that's going through a tough time, or a kind of this macroscopic crisis in terms of the whole country. But honestly, I don't know if this will kind of help stimulate like the recession that's coming for our country. I don't think it will help kind of just get us in kind of a like stable position to kind of push ourselves back up to growth or anything like that.
Yeah, just on your point with the 1,000 for every adult American, there's actually a lot of economists that have seen that this actually won't help at all, as in most monthly expenses exceed $1,000 for even middle class to lower class families. Even just the expenses of food and gasoline itself can be more. Obviously, you know, within quarantine, there's some expenses that just erode from the overall monthly bill. But, you know, since this will be kind of a one-time injection, that this will kind of just put a Band-Aid on the problem, in my mind. And I think there's a lot of moving parts right now. Obviously, I'm not at that position of power, and I'm not there for a good reason, so I can't tell you the answer now. But I think kind of the cash injection could, you know, obviously be used for something better. I think, like I said, if they predict that this virus will peak in June, July, that this is the right move now, because all you need to do is kind of weather the storm. But if you're trying to if this is going to be a long-term impact, as in this will like move into like all 3 quarters of this year, on a financial basis, that I think you're going to have to support a lot of these large corporations. I can speak more about that if you guys would like, but Joss, do you have any inputs on what your thoughts from an economy standpoint?
Yeah, I think that like the idea of giving everyone $1,000, I've seen $1,000, $1,500, even $2,000 injected into the economy direct to the consumer, or to the American public. I mean, first of all, it's not such a radical idea. Like, a once-off isn't so rare, because I believe Bush did it in, the second Bush presidency did it when he had was running a surplus. Obviously, then it was actually a significantly worse idea probably to do. And I mean, I understand the concept, because it would try to be helping with that liquidity crisis, putting a little bit of cash into people's hands, because a lot of Americans aren't working right now due to either layoffs or just their hourly workers who can't get any work because everything's shut down. So I like the idea. But I like you said, I just don't know if it's going to be enough. What I would really like to see them do is freeze all mortgage payments and rent, because that's a significant chunk of most people's income, and there's really no way for them to actually be paying that right now. And then also do what they did in the 2007-2008 financial crisis, where they a lot of people were very upset that they bailed out a lot of big banks, but a lot of those bailouts were actually just zero interest loans. So I'd be interested to see them do that with maybe like airlines, because that's an industry that it would be nice for us to still have once we get back from this virus, which is going to happen. So I think that $1,000 a month would be a very small start, and I really don't think in the grand scheme of things it would be relatively that expensive, to be completely honest. Because there's $1,000 to every American is nothing compared to like giving $1 billion bailout, multi-billion-dollar bailout to a massive industry, and I think we could do both.
Yeah. 2 things before we move on to kind of the science as well as cultural impact. I think the 2 things I want to touch upon is kind of monetary policy and what's been done there. The Federal Reserve, cut interest rates to the bound of 0 to 0.25%, which this has been in 2 foul swoops from where we were, 1.5 to 1.75% before this COVID-19 even hit the globe. I think within monetary policy and the goal, I understand that they're trying to control unemployment within the economy, but I believe that if there was an impending recession, monetary policy now cannot save us from that recession, as in they've used all their bullets in the gun, if you will, now, before we even see a strong material impact. So I know they're trying to get ahead of the ball and trying to save, the overall U.S. economy from an impending recession. But I think at this point, if there was a recession and there was economic contraction, that you would want that monetary policy stimulus to come into play. And I understand they're trying to move the ball on quantitative easing and buybacks of long-term bond maturities and all that. Lastly, with the bailouts, before we move on, I think they need to target industries. Personally, what I know from American Airlines, from a company perspective, that they've bought back a lot of their shares, and they've actually spent $50 billion on share buybacks. So if you think about that, that's $50 billion that's not going into the company. That's $50 billion that's used to make their investors appreciate their stock price. And so if you think about it, if Congress is going to give them $50 billion bailout for money that they spent on just plainly share buybacks in the past, Congress is almost giving American Airlines or whatever airline industry money to just buy back their own shares, or kind of paying them back for doing that. So if you think about it, American Airlines could be in a better position now if they invested that money and or held on to it for a potential, epidemic. Not that they could have foreseen that, but they could have been better prepared instead of just kind of wasting that than equity investors. And so I think obviously it's at this point it needs to be done. I think a lot of these major airlines need to be helped. But if you think about it on an overall basis, I think that, there's a lot of things that could have been done better. But now, we would really like to hear from Matt on the science and cultural impact of this virus, as well as Chalice and I will be chipping in.
Okay, so before we get into the underlying science of this pandemic and also just the coronavirus in general, let's first pretty much talk about what a virus is in general. So viruses have been around pretty much since life on Earth was created, and they're essentially a system that just has RNA, which is like the building blocks of the system, and it's protected by almost like armor that's a lipid bilayer and usually some type of protein around this lipid bilayer. And what a virus does is that it needs to be in a host, for example, a human body, other types of animals such as bats, pangolins, birds, pigs, any type of animal that has an immune system. And once this virus gets into this host, it can then start to replicate and pretty much just destroy the immune system of that host. And this is pretty much what's happening right now. This is what happens with the common flu. And this is what causes deaths in any type of animal that has a virus. So getting into coronavirus, COVID-19, it's specifically a type of virus that attacks the respiratory system. That's how it gets into your body. And this specific type of virus is very similar to SARS, which is the severe acute respiratory syndrome that we saw in late 2002, early 2003 in China, that went around the world in a matter of weeks, which luckily just kind of sporadically disappeared and almost became what we are seeing today. The difference between SARS and COVID-19, though, is the protein makeup on the virus itself. COVID-19, now seen in labs, has a type of spiky protein made up around this lipid bilayer that can attach to your cells very efficiently that SARS could not do. And this makes the virus transmittable a lot faster, a lot easier, and can attack your cells more efficiently and at a much faster pace. Another good fact to know about COVID-19 is that it's also transmitted through the air, as in the droplets in your breath as you're breathing can go in the air and can be in the air for a couple hours. It could be on plastic, cardboard, and other types of metal for over 24 hours. So be sure that you're wiping down your surfaces at home and paying attention to washing your hands 20 seconds or more, and taking out that Purell and putting on your hands and giving a nice massage.
So, Matt, I'm curious, and I know maybe some of our listeners have a similar question, but how is this really affecting the culture and kind of social interactions between Americans and across the globe? And do you think this will, depending on how long the virus continues, how will this really affect how we operate as a society?
That's a great question, Nick. Well, first off, this is really affecting our culture behavior in terms of the economics of it, with our economy, but also just how we behave in general. Specifically in the U.S., people are going almost stir crazy after only 8 days in their houses. Sports has been gone for 9 days now, and SportsCenter is getting kind of repetitive with their highlights of old, very well-known highlights, and people are also not really following this quarantine that well. Today, for example, I was driving by a park, and there was easily over 20 cars in the parking lot, people walking, playing basketball. Here in our country, I definitely do think people aren't taking that seriously, specifically in Pennsylvania. We're very fortunate so far that there hasn't been many confirmed cases here in Center County, and people are kind of just chilling out, kind of relaxing, still going to smaller social events and not taking this pandemic that seriously. But on a larger macroscopic scale, this is definitely going to affect our behavior. This is definitely going to affect our behavior in terms of public health and the seriousness of a better public health system and infrastructure. Almost right now, our infrastructure for public health is collapsing. A lot of hospital beds, just in regular care, but also in the ICU, are filling up. We're running out of respirators, N95 masks. We haven't taken this seriously before, as we saw with H1N1 around 2010, SARS before that in 2002, 2003. We need to put more money in that. We need to pay more attention to these pandemics right now and the future pandemics in the future, because these are not going to go away. Viruses have been around, like I said before, since the start of life itself. It has been pretty much messing with us on a societal level for millennia. Black Death, bubonic plague, the Spanish flu, 1918, SARS, Ebola, and so we need to, I think, be more proactive, more cautious, and more educated on this issue starting now.
Yeah, so, like, I think, as we near the end of the podcast here, I think one final thing that would be good to hear from all of our hosts here at MVC is kind of what we could have done maybe to A, prevent this, but B, what can be done to prevent the next pandemic, or what we believe can be done to prevent. So maybe just going from my perspective, I think the biggest thing, and what has been the last kind of epicenter of SARS and now coronavirus, has been like those open markets in China. So I think, especially after this virus, I think the Chinese government will probably try to crack down on these open markets. Obviously, they could be essential to the economy of cities like Wuhan, where you do have a lot of demand for this fresh meat. But I believe this is where the primary interaction between, animal viruses and human viruses are occurring. So there has to be some way to regulate and or get rid of these open markets. And I think moving on to the, in the future, I just think more money needs to be pumped into healthcare. I think, I just think overall, like, that's kind of what needs to be done. Obviously, you don't want to be drilling money into something that's not going to be getting benefits out right away. But that'd be my 2 cents on that situation. So what about you guys?
Well, I completely agree with you on everything you said. Closing down wet markets in general, huge for stopping these viruses, these zoonotic viruses, and also really building up a healthcare system. Everyone, I think, should have healthcare. People now that are going to the hospitals getting treated for COVID-19 and recovering have to pay up to almost $40,000. They don't have healthcare. So I definitely think that needs to pretty much be corrected, since pandemics are not going to go away. They've actually found that outbreaks are actually accelerating since travel and technology is advancing. I also think that we need to be more educated in the sciences in terms of understanding what a virus is, how you can go about stopping the transmission of viruses, and also taking information given by scientists more seriously, and kind of not thinking, oh, this is fake news. Actually doing your research based on what is being said and finding the answers for yourself, being more investigative.
First of all, I could not agree with what you two guys said any more than I possibly do now. But I'm going to look at it from a completely different perspective, because this is something that I was really intrigued by whenever the COVID started out. And I did an extensive amount of research into it, and I actually wrote a blog post about it if you want to go check it out, sites.michaelchalice.com. And it's about the environmental impacts that have led to COVID-19. There's actually twofold. First of all, and probably more obviously, COVID-19 is primarily a respiratory disease. And as air quality decreases, the number of people who are going to be significantly and negatively impacted by COVID-19 increases. So having bad air conditions, which is a main factor in climate change, actually has increased the number of deaths we've had. And then from a slightly more, abstract perspective, the actual climate change has significantly changed the way that animals interact with each other. As the amount of natural resources and natural habitats for animals has decreased, their migration patterns have had to change drastically, and those unnatural changes have actually led to transmission of diseases much more easily. Because if you have the same number of animals, you have to pack them into a smaller area, or you have animals from two different areas who have to kind of coexist in some habitat that's not quite right for either of them, it can lead to increased transmission of these viruses and increased mutation of these viruses, which is what we're seeing. So I think that another aspect that we can look at is helping the environment. And I honestly believe, this is kind of an aside, that helping the environment is a panacea to almost all of our worldly woes. That's my take. Just one man's opinion.
That's a very great perspective. I definitely overlooked the whole climate and environmental impact of this virus. But I think, to end on a good note, I think we should go around the room and, talk about, what's been our favorite quarantine pastime. Personally for me, it's been a lot of reading, a lot of gaming, and a lot of, Zooming, with my friends and family across the world. How about you, Matt? What have you done?
Well, I've been doing something similar. I've been reading a lot. I got 17 books for this past Christmas. I've been digging into that. I'm on The Double Helix right now by James Watson. That's been a good read so far.
Shout out, James.
Yes.
The sequel to The Helix.
Yes.
Yeah, I've been doing most of the same thing you two guys have been doing. Honestly, my favorite thing about the quarantine has just been able to get really close with my roommates, Nate and Jeff, and we've just been hanging out a lot more than we ever really have before. And it's definitely something that I think in 6 months' time, 10 months' time, when we're back in a normal life, we're gonna look back on this and it's gonna look like a fever dream. It's gonna be that one weird summer that you had. I'm looking forward to looking back on it fondly, because right now I'm getting a little stir crazy. Not gonna lie.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. It's our first ever podcast. I hope you really enjoyed.
Please also remember that we are not experts on this topic. We're just three friends discussing this together.
As well as COVID-19 is an ever-developing story, we are looking as a podcast team to release a part 2. In the future, we would also like you as the viewer to reach out to us on our Twitter and YouTube at MVC Podcast for both. And, tell us what you want to hear next.
Thank you.